So if we think of what goes into to make a pot, like a bit like a recipe in terms of the ingredients that you might add into the clay, or ingredients that or elements that are already within the clay that you're working with, then across the Moss Farm assemblage we're seeing a relatively simple range of sort of pot ingredients that could potentially all be found within the local landscape. So the three main things that we found with regards to the sort of fabric of the pots is they contain either flint, which is burnt flint, and flint is obviously sort of fairly ubiquitous in the region, so you could pick it up from the soil, topsoil, or from the surrounding area potentially. And that's been burnt, and for the fine wares that gets pounded into a kind of almost like flint dust, which they add in to the clay, and it allows them to still get a sort of lustrous finish on the exterior. For the coarse wares, they're putting in quite crushed burnt flint, but they're quite big pieces. They may be sort of up to 6 millimeters in size, some of them. So it gives this almost like hobnob biscuit-like texture on the outside, very, very rough. And again, there's a real tactile distinction being drawn between the coarse wares and the fine wares, and that has to go in from the very beginning of when you make that pot, so you're aware of what you're making as well. So again, they're very, very rough pots, and you can imagine the potter's hands being extremely callous working with it, because they're so rough that if you run your hands even around it now, you can feel it kind of tearing at your skin a little bit. The other ingredients, I suppose, is shell, and in fact a lot of the pots we see before us here have shell in the clay matrix. Now that shell is actually, unlike the flint, it's probably not been added to the clay. It's probably found naturally within the clay, and so the potters are seeking out clay sources that have this shell in it. And some of the sediments around Moss Farm have shell in, and we think at the moment they're probably derived from those, so they would have been locally available. That shell again is still may go through various processes of refinement before it's used to make pots, so you can still have this coarse fine distinction. So certainly some of the burnished fineware bowls will have very, very finely processed pieces of shell in it, as if clay's been worked and cleaned prior to making it, whereas the coarse wares, they're not doing that kind of preparation work. But it's certainly, you can still see, if you look at close up on some of these pots, you can still see bits of shell in them. And finally, we're finding a smaller number of pots with grog in, and grog being sort of reworked, broken down pieces of older pots that have been crushed up and then added back into clay to make a new pot. And when we look at those tiny bits of grog in the pots, you can see shell in that grog. So they're breaking up shelly wares and then reusing and recycling them to build new pots. So those are the sort of three main sort of fabrics that we're finding, which is really the sort of three main pottery ingredients, I suppose. Well, this is the smallest late Bronze Age pot I've ever seen, to be totally honest. And I keep looking at it thinking it's a little Frere Rocher, because it's about the size of one, and you put it in gold foil, then it would very much look like one. But it's a little finger pot. It could only have been made by, working a little ball of clay, like so, into this tiny, tiny little pot that must be less than 3 centimetres in diameter. It's incredibly unusual to see a pot this small, and I can't think of another context where I've seen anything like this. That may be because if you broke this and you found a tiny fragment of rim, which is kind of imagine the sort of small shards we might normally find in an excavation that may be, less than the size of your fingernail, say, then it'd be very difficult to reconstruct it as being part of a pot that's so small. And I think we haven't even begun to imagine that there could be pots this small in the late Bronze Age. Now, I can't imagine this was for any, it's not a cooking pot, obviously, from its size. What it contained is a mystery, I think, at the moment, that we may be able to sample it, we may be able to tell a little bit more about it, but it might not have been anything to do with cooking which is what you mentioned. It might have contained something that was perhaps involved in cooking. It could contain some kind of spice or something, some other commodity that was, more valuable perhaps, that you'd want to keep it separate in a little container. But who knows what it was? It could have been all sorts of things, but it's just lovely to see something so tiny and, but thoughtfully made as well.